Tonight we are going deep into one of the most difficult questions in all of Star Wars. Who was the most powerful Jedi in history? It sounds like a simple question, but the deeper you go into Star Wars lore, the less simple it becomes. Because power in Star Wars is not only about who can win a duel, it is not only about who can lift the largest object, it is not only about who has the highest connection to the Force, the most impressive lightsaber technique, or the greatest battlefield reputation. A Jedi's power can mean many things: raw Force potential, wisdom, discipline, combat skill, spiritual enlightenment, the ability to resist darkness, the ability to inspire others, the ability to change history without needing to conquer it. And sometimes, the most powerful Jedi is not the one who destroys the most enemies. Sometimes it is the one who refuses to become what the galaxy expects them to become. So tonight, we are not simply ranking warriors, we are walking through the long history of the Jedi, from the ancient days of the Old Republic, to the fall of the Sith, to the Clone Wars, to the rise of Luke Skywalker, and beyond. We are looking at the Jedi who shaped the galaxy, the Jedi who stood against Sith Lords, the Jedi who carried the Order through war, collapse, exile, and rebirth, and the Jedi whose power was so great that even the dark side had to bend around them. This is the story of the most powerful Jedi in all of history. And to understand that question, we have to begin with the Jedi themselves. Long before the Clone Wars, long before Darth Vader, long before Luke Skywalker stared at the twin suns of Tatooine, long before the Jedi Temple rose above Coruscant. The Jedi began as seekers, not soldiers, not generals, not guardians of a republic stretching across the stars. Seekers, beings who felt something deeper moving through the universe, something binding life together, something beyond politics, beyond technology, beyond ordinary strength. The Force. In the earliest days, the Jedi were not yet the polished order we know from the prequel era. They were students of balance, they were mystics, they were philosophers, they were warriors only when they had to be. And the most powerful among them were not always the loudest figures in history. Some became legends because they fought great wars, some because they defeated Sith Lords, some because they survived impossible darkness, and some because they understood the Force so deeply that their presence changed everyone around them. This is the first thing to remember. The Jedi were not created to dominate the Force. They were created to listen to it, and that is what separates the greatest Jedi from the greatest Sith. The Sith often seek power as possession. They want to seize the Force, bend it, break it, use it as a weapon of self. The Jedi, at their best, seek power through surrender, not weakness, not passivity, but alignment. They become powerful because they stop trying to make the Force serve only them. They become powerful because they allow themselves to serve something greater. That is why the question of the most powerful Jedi is so complicated. Because in Star Wars, the greatest power is often not control. It is harmony, and yet history is filled with Jedi who are terrifyingly powerful in more visible ways. Jedi who could defeat armies, Jedi who could face Sith Lords, Jedi who could move objects the size of ships, Jedi who could sense events across the galaxy. Jedi whose names became warnings, legends, or myths. So let us begin far back in the old stories, in the age when the Jedi and Sith were locked in conflicts so ancient that by the time of the films, many of them sounded almost like religious memory. One of the first great names that rises from that deep past is Nomi Sunrider. Nomi is not always the first name people mention when they think of the most powerful Jedi. She does not have the mainstream fame of Yoda. She does not have the cinematic weight of Luke Skywalker. She does not have the frightening potential of Anakin. But in the ancient legends history of the Jedi, Nomi Sunrider is one of the most important Jedi who ever lived. And her story begins not as a warrior seeking glory, but as someone pulled into the great struggle almost against her will. She was not born into the role of battlefield legend. She was a wife, a mother, a woman whose life was torn apart by violence. After the death of her husband, Andor Sunrider, Nomi was forced onto the Jedi path, carrying grief, responsibility, and a connection to the Force she had not yet fully accepted. That is one of the reasons her power feels different. Nomi's greatness does not begin with arrogance, it begins with loss. And in Star Wars, loss can become many things. For the Sith, loss often becomes rage. For Anakin Skywalker, fear of loss becomes the doorway to Vader. For Darth Maul, loss becomes obsession. But for Nomi, loss becomes service. Her power grows not because she wants revenge, but because she chooses to protect. She eventually becomes one of the great Jedi of her age. helping oppose the Sith during the Great Sith War and confronting one of the most tragic fallen Jedi in history, Ulic Qel-Droma. Ulic was once a heroic Jedi, brave, charismatic, a champion of the light. But like many tragic figures in Star Wars, he believed he could enter darkness and control it. He thought he could infiltrate evil without being consumed by it. Instead, the dark side took him. He became the apprentice of Exile, one of the most dangerous Sith Lords of the ancient era. He helped unleash war across the galaxy. He killed his own brother, and by the end of his fall, the Jedi faced a terrible question. Could someone like Ulic be stopped without simply destroying him? Nomi's answer was one of the most dramatic uses of Jedi power in the old lore. She cut Ulic off from the Force. Completely. That act is almost impossible to overstate. To a Force user, the Force is not just a tool. It is perception, instinct, identity, breath beneath breath. For a Jedi or Sith to be cut off from the Force is like being exiled from part of reality itself. Nomi did not defeat Ulic by overpowering him in a conventional duel. She used the Force in a way that changed the condition of his existence. That is a different kind of power, a terrifying kind. And yet Nomi was not a Sith. She did not use this power for domination. She used it to end a cycle of destruction. This is why she deserves a place in any discussion of the most powerful Jedi. Because her strength was not only in combat, it was in spiritual authority. The kind of authority that allowed her to stand before someone corrupted by the dark side and sever the connection that made him dangerous. Nomi Sunrider reminds us that Jedi power is not always loud. Sometimes it is final. Sometimes it is not a storm of lightning or a battlefield victory. Sometimes it is a single act that changes the fate of a fallen soul. And yet, if we move forward through the Old Republic, another name appears. A name surrounded by mystery, contradiction, and legend. Revan. Revan is one of the most complicated figures in Star Wars history because he was not simply a Jedi. He was a Jedi Knight, a war hero, a fallen Sith Lord, a redeemed champion, a strategist, a symbol, a wound in the Force. And depending on the era of his life we are talking about, either one of the galaxy's greatest saviors or one of its greatest threats. Revan's story begins during the Mandalorian Wars. The Mandalorians were tearing through the galaxy. World after world suffered. The Republic was slow. The Jedi Council hesitated. They feared that joining the war would lead the Jedi into something darker. And perhaps they were right. But Revan could not stand aside. To him, inaction looked like cowardice. He believed that if the Jedi had the power to help, then refusing to act was its own kind of failure. So he went to war, and many Jedi followed him. This decision made Revan a hero to some and a dangerous radical to others. But there is no denying his power. Revan was not only strong in the Force, he was brilliant, a strategist of rare ability, a leader who could inspire armies, a warrior who could face the greatest threats of his age. And during the Mandalorian Wars, he became something the Jedi Order often feared, a Jedi shaped by war. War changes Jedi. This is one of Star Wars' oldest warnings. The Jedi can fight, they can defend, they can protect. But when a Jedi becomes too comfortable in war, the line between Guardian and Conqueror begins to blur. Revan crossed that line. After defeating the Mandalorians, he and Malak discovered deeper Sith influence in the unknown regions. And rather than returning unchanged, they fell. Revan became Darth Revan, a Sith Lord, a conqueror, a figure who nearly destroyed the Republic he once fought to save. And yet Revan's story did not end there. After his capture and the rewriting of his identity, Revan returned to the light, defeated Darth Malak, and became one of the strangest examples of redemption in Jedi history. What makes Revan's power so difficult to measure is that it does not fit neatly into one category. As a Jedi, he was extraordinary. As a Sith, he was terrifying. As a strategist, he changed galactic history. As a Force user, he stood among the most gifted of any age. But was he the most powerful Jedi? That depends on what we mean. If we mean raw combat effectiveness, Revan belongs near the top. If we mean strategic brilliance, he may be unmatched among Jedi. If we mean spiritual purity, his fall complicates the answer. Revan shows us that power without balance can become catastrophe. He was strong enough to save worlds, strong enough to defeat enemies no one else could, but not always strong enough to remain untouched by the darkness he fought. And this is important, because the most powerful Jedi cannot simply be the one with the greatest ability. Ability without discipline can become disaster. The Jedi feared this truth for thousands of years, and Revan proved them right. But he also proved something else, that even after the fall, return is possible, that identity can be broken and reforged, that the light can still call to someone who has become an instrument of darkness. This makes Revan one of the most powerful and most unstable figures in Jedi history. A legend of strength, a warning against pride, and a reminder that the Force does not measure greatness the way armies do. Moving further through the long history of the Order, we eventually reach another era of legendary Jedi, the time of the Old Republic, when Jedi and Sith clashed again and again across the galaxy. And in this era, one of the brightest names is Satele Shan. A descendant of Revan and Satele Shan, Satele carries one of the heaviest legacies in Jedi history. To be descended from Revan is not simply to inherit greatness, it is to inherit a warning. The bloodline carries heroism and darkness, victory and catastrophe, redemption and fall. Satele Shan emerges in an age when the Sith Empire has returned and the galaxy is once again divided by war. She becomes Grand Master of the Jedi Order, a warrior, a teacher, a symbol of resistance, and in battle, her power is undeniable. She stands against Sith warriors with extraordinary skill. She channels the Force with intensity, speed, and control. She is capable of feats that make her feel like one of the great Jedi champions of her era. But Satele's deeper power is not only in combat, it is in endurance. She carries the Jedi Order through one of the most dangerous periods in its history. She faces the Sith not as an abstract memory, but as an active empire, a military force, a civilization of dark side power. To lead the Jedi during such an age requires more than strength, it requires patience, wisdom, the ability to make impossible decisions when every choice costs lives. Satele also represents the tension between attachment and duty. Her personal life, including her connection to Theron Shan, complicates the image of the perfect detached Jedi. And that is important because the Jedi Order, across history, often struggles with what to do about love, family, and personal bonds. Some Jedi suppress attachment so rigidly that they become blind to the emotional needs of those around them. Others fall because they cannot bear the fear of loss. Satele stands in the middle of that ancient tension. She is not perfect, but she is powerful, and her power is the power of someone who carries legacy without being consumed by it. In a galaxy where the name Revan still echoes, Satele Shan becomes proof that a bloodline touched by darkness can still produce light. That matters. Because Jedi history is not simply a list of victories, it is a long argument about whether the past controls the future. Satele's life says it does not have to. Then there is another kind of Jedi power, the kind that appears not through bloodline or battlefield legend, but through the purity of connection. A Jedi like Meetra Surik, the Jedi Exile. Meetra is one of the most unusual Force users in all of Star Wars lore. Her story begins in war, like Revan's. She followed Revan into the Mandalorian Wars. She fought at Malachor 5, and at Malachor, something terrible happened. The mass shadow generator was activated. The destruction was immense. Lives were extinguished on an unimaginable scale. The wound in the Force was catastrophic. And Meetra survived by cutting herself off from the Force. This is what makes her so unique. Many Jedi fear losing the Force. Many Sith would rather die than be cut off from it. But Meetra lived as an absence, a wound, a silence where connection should have been. And later, when she returned to the galaxy, she became something strange and powerful. A person who formed deep bonds with others. A person whose presence could awaken lost strength. A person who carried emptiness and connection at the same time. The Jedi Exile's power is not like Yoda's, not like Luke's, not like Mace Windu's. It is unsettling, almost metaphysical. She is powerful because of what was taken from her and what formed around that absence. She shows that the Force is not only about abundance. Sometimes it is about wound, echo, hunger, silence, and survival. Her enemies, especially Darth Nihilus, embody that theme in monstrous form. Nihilus is not simply a Sith Lord, he is a wound that consumes, a being of hunger, a dark side catastrophe wearing the shape of a person, and Meetra's existence makes her uniquely suited to face that kind of threat. This is why she deserves to be mentioned in any deep conversation about the most powerful Jedi. Not because she can necessarily defeat every Jedi in a duel, but because her relationship to the Force is one of the most unusual in history. She reveals that power is not always clean. Sometimes a Jedi's greatest strength comes from surviving the place where connection was broken, and still choosing to protect life. But before the story reaches the late Republic, there is another age we should slow down for. An age that shows the Jedi at a very different point in their history. Not exhausted by the Clone Wars, not blinded yet by the shadow of Darth Sidious, not reduced to fugitives, survivors, or half-remembered legends, but bright, confident, expansive, almost mythic, the High Republic. This era matters because it shows the Jedi before the fall, but not in the same way as the prequel era. The Jedi of the High Republic are still tied to the Republic, but they feel more like guardians of possibility than servants of a failing political machine. They travel to the frontier, they protect hyperspace routes, they help worlds in crisis. They stand as symbols of peace in places where fear, chaos, and violence could easily take root. And in this age, the Jedi are often described not as tired monks trapped in bureaucracy, but as lights moving through the galaxy. The light of the Jedi. That phrase is important, because it tells us how the galaxy sees them, not only as warriors, not only as diplomats, but as something almost sacred. When a Jedi arrives, people believe help has arrived. When a Jedi speaks, people believe there is still reason in the universe. When a Jedi ignites a lightsaber, it is not supposed to mean conquest. It is supposed to mean protection. And that makes the High Republic important to the question of the most powerful Jedi. Because this era reminds us what Jedi power looks like when it is not yet fully distorted by war. One of the great Jedi of this age is Avar Kriss. Avar's power is not only that she is strong in the Force, it is the way she experiences the Force. To Avar, the Force is like music, a song, a vast harmony made of every living being. Every person, every creature, every presence in the galaxy has a note. And the Force is not only energy moving through those notes, it is the song they create together. That is a beautiful way to understand Jedi power. Because the Sith do not hear the galaxy as a song. The Sith hear the galaxy as noise, something to silence, something to dominate, something to reduce to one voice, their own. Avar Kriss represents the opposite. She listens, she feels connection, she understands that the Force is not a private weapon, it is a shared reality. And when a Jedi understands the Force this way, their power becomes very different from Sith power. They are not trying to make the song obey them. They are trying to protect the song from being broken. This makes Avar one of the most important examples of Jedi strength. Not because she is the final answer to the question, not because she stands above Luke, Yoda, Anakin, or Revan, but because she shows us a form of Jedi power that is easy to forget. The power of harmony, the power to hear others, the power to connect many lives into something greater than fear. In a galaxy where war constantly tries to separate people into enemies, armies, factions, and tools, that kind of power matters. Avar's gift reminds us that the Jedi are strongest when they remember connection. The Sith isolate. The Jedi connect. The Sith turn pain inward until it becomes hatred. The Jedi try to turn pain outward until it becomes compassion. That is why Avar's way of feeling the Force belongs in this story, because the most powerful Jedi is not simply the one with the strongest individual will. Sometimes the most powerful Jedi is the one who remembers that no one stands alone in the Force. Then there is Stellan Gios. Stellan feels like the perfect image of a High Republic Jedi Knight. Noble, composed, radiant. The kind of Jedi people imagine when they want to believe the Order is everything it claims to be. He is not only a warrior, he is a symbol. And symbols have power. That may sound simple, but it is one of the most important truths in Star Wars. A symbol can make people brave. A symbol can hold a civilization together. A symbol can make a frightened person believe that darkness has not won. The Jedi are symbols long before Luke becomes one, and Stellan Gios carries that symbolic power with dignity. He shows what the Jedi are supposed to look like at their highest public ideal. Calm in crisis, strong without cruelty, brave without arrogance, visible without becoming vain. But this also reveals a danger, because when the Jedi become symbols, they can begin to feel pressure to always appear certain, always appear wise, always appear serene, and that can become a trap. If everyone expects the Jedi to be perfect, the Jedi may begin hiding their own doubts. If the galaxy sees the Jedi as flawless, the Jedi may forget how to admit failure. If the Order becomes too committed to its image, it may stop noticing the cracks beneath that image. This is one of the slow tragedies of the Jedi. They begin as servants of the Force, but over time, they also become representatives of the Republic. Symbols of stability, symbols of law, symbols of civilization itself. And once that happens, it becomes harder for them to step back and ask whether the system they serve is still worthy of them. Stellan Gios matters because he shows both the beauty and the danger of the Jedi ideal. The beauty is that a Jedi can inspire people simply by standing in the light. The danger is that symbols can become statues, and statues cannot listen. Then there is Elzar Mann. Elzar is one of the most interesting Jedi of the High Republic, because his power is not calm in the simple way. He is gifted, visionary, emotional, intense. He sees possibilities. He feels deeply, and because of that, he shows one of the most important truths about powerful Jedi. The stronger your connection to the Force, the more vulnerable you may become to what the Force shows you. Visions can be blessings, but they can also become burdens. A vision can warn a Jedi, but it can also frighten them, and fear of the future is one of the oldest doors to the dark side. Anakin Skywalker is the clearest example. He sees death, he fears loss, he wants control, and that fear becomes the chain Palpatine uses to pull him into darkness. But Anakin is not the only Jedi to struggle with visions, emotion, and the weight of possible futures. Elzar Mann shows that this tension existed long before the Clone Wars. He reminds us that Jedi are not powerful because they feel nothing. That is a misunderstanding. The best Jedi are not empty. They are not machines. They are not beings without fear, grief, desire, or pain. The best Jedi are powerful because they can feel deeply without being ruled completely by what they feel. That is a very difficult kind of discipline. It is easier to pretend not to feel. It is easier to bury fear. It is easier to call attachment forbidden and imagine the problem is solved. But buried fear does not disappear. It waits, and the dark side knows how to speak to what has been buried. Elzar's struggle makes him important because he reveals the emotional burden of Jedi power. A Jedi who sees too much may begin to think they must control everything. A Jedi who feels too deeply may begin to fear loss too strongly. A Jedi who wants to save everyone may begin to justify anything. And that is how the fall begins. Not always with hatred, sometimes with responsibility. Sometimes with compassion, twisted by fear. Sometimes with the belief that if you are powerful enough, you can force the future to become safe. The Jedi must resist that temptation, not by becoming cold, but by learning trust. That is why Elzar belongs in this meditation on power. He is not the most powerful Jedi in history, but he shows how dangerous power becomes when visions and emotions are not met with honesty. Then there is Porter Engle, the Blade of Bardotta, a Jedi remembered as one of the great lightsaber warriors of the High Republic. His skill with a blade became legendary, and at first that sounds like the kind of power people usually mean when they ask who the strongest Jedi was. Who was the best fighter? Who could defeat the most enemies? Who could stand longest against the Sith? But Porter Engle is interesting because his story does not only point toward violence, it points beyond it. Because later in life, Porter becomes quieter, humbler. He is remembered not only as a blade, but as someone who can put the blade away. And that matters. A Jedi warrior must be able to fight, but a Jedi who only knows how to fight is incomplete. The lightsaber is not supposed to be the Jedi's identity, it is supposed to be the Jedi's tool. There is a difference. The Sith often become their weapons, their rage, their lightning, their blades, their armor, their reputation. All of it becomes part of the self they refuse to surrender. But a Jedi has to know who they are when the lightsaber is not ignited. A Jedi must know how to be still, how to serve in small ways, how to protect without needing glory, how to live without constantly proving strength. Porter Engle reminds us that the greatest warrior may not be the one who always fights. It may be the one who can fight when necessary, and still choose peace when the fighting is done. That is a rare kind of mastery, because many warriors survive war, but never truly leave it. Revan could not put the war down. Anakin could not stop trying to control outcomes. Mace stood close to the edge of righteous violence. Even Luke at times had to learn when not to strike. Porter shows another path. A blade can rest, a warrior can become gentle. Power does not have to demand constant expression. Sometimes the greatest proof of power is restraint. Then there is Bel Zettifar. Bel is not the greatest Jedi in history, but that is exactly why he matters. Because the Jedi Order is not made only of its greatest masters. It is made of students, Padawans, young knights. People still learning what courage means. People who are afraid, uncertain, wounded, and not yet complete. Bel's bond with his master, Loden Greatstorm, is one of the most meaningful parts of his story. Because the relationship between master and apprentice is one of the deepest structures in Jedi life. A Sith Master trains an apprentice as a rival, a weapon, and eventually a threat. A Jedi Master trains an apprentice as a continuation of the light. That difference reveals the soul of both traditions. For the Sith, teaching is competition. For the Jedi, teaching is trust. A master gives a student not only technique, but a way of seeing the galaxy, a way of handling fear, a way of facing loss, a way of using strength without becoming possessed by it. And when a master is taken away, the student faces one of the oldest Jedi tests. What will grief become? Will grief become rage? Will it become despair? Will it become revenge? Or will it become service? This question repeats across the entire Star Wars saga. Obi-Wan loses Qui-Gon, Anakin loses his mother, Luke loses Obi-Wan, Ahsoka loses the Order, Kanan loses his master, Bell loses Loden. Again and again, the Jedi are not tested by whether they can avoid grief. No one can avoid grief forever. They are tested by what grief becomes inside them. The Sith turn grief into possession. The Jedi try to turn grief into compassion. Bell Zettifar belongs here because he shows the Jedi path in its unfinished form. The path of someone still learning, still hurting, still choosing. And perhaps that is more relatable than the great masters. Because most people are not Yoda. Most people are not Luke at the end of his journey. Most people are Bell, trying to keep going after the loss of someone who gave their life meaning. That too is Jedi strength. The High Republic also reminds us of something important. The enemies of the Jedi are not always Sith, and that matters. Because if we only define Jedi greatness by Sith confrontation, we make the Jedi smaller. The Jedi do not exist only to fight Sith. They exist to protect life, to serve peace, to guard balance. Sometimes the enemy is a Dark Lord, but sometimes the enemy is chaos, cruelty, fear, disaster, exploitation. The Nihil, for example, are not Sith in the traditional sense. They are raiders, destroyers, a storm of violence and disorder. They do not represent the dark side in the same ancient religious way as the Sith, but they still test the Jedi. Because Jedi power is not only useful against red lightsabers, it must also matter when ordinary people are afraid. When hyperspace disasters tear through systems, when worlds are threatened, when the frontier looks to the Republic and asks whether its promises mean anything. The High Republic Jedi are powerful because they are trying to make the galaxy safer before the age of total war. They are not only fighting evil, they are building trust. And trust is one of the slowest forms of power. Fear can be created quickly. An empire can create fear in a single day. A weapon can destroy a city in a moment. A Sith Lord can terrify a room by entering it, but trust takes time. Trust requires consistency. Trust requires service. Trust requires people to believe that when the Jedi arrive, they are not arriving to rule, they are arriving to help. That is what Palpatine later destroys. Not just the Jedi Order, not just their bodies, not just their temple. He destroys the trust attached to the name Jedi. He convinces the galaxy that its guardians were traitors. He turns memory itself into a weapon. That is one of his greatest victories, and it is why Luke's later task is so enormous. Luke does not simply have to defeat evil. He has to make the word Jedi mean hope again. The High Republic shows us what that word once meant at its brightest, and because of that, it makes the later fall more tragic. And after that brighter age, the long river of Jedi history brings us toward the more familiar era. The Jedi Order of the late Republic, the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the Council Chamber, the long robes, the polished halls, the belief that the Sith are gone, and here, one name towers over almost everyone: Yoda. For centuries, Yoda is the face of Jedi wisdom, small in body, ancient in years, quiet in speech, but vast in presence. By the time of the Clone Wars, Yoda has trained generations of Jedi. He has seen the Republic change. He has seen the Order become more formal, more political, more entangled with galactic institutions. He has watched children become Padawans, Padawans become knights, knights become masters, and masters pass into the Force. His power is immense. In combat, Yoda is shockingly fast. Against Count Dooku on Geonosis, he moves like living light. The old master becomes a blur of green energy, flipping, spinning, pressing against a Sith Lord who had just defeated Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. Against Darth Sidious in the Senate, Yoda fights the Dark Lord of the Sith at the very center of the Republic's transformation into Empire. That duel is more than a fight. It is the old Jedi Order battling the hidden Sith victory in the chamber where democracy has already died. Yoda's power in the Force is undeniable, He can absorb and redirect Force lightning. He can sense darkness across the galaxy. He can commune with the deeper mysteries of the Force. He eventually learns the path to preserving consciousness after death. And that last point may be more important than any duel. Because Yoda's greatest evolution does not happen in battle. It happens in failure. This is what makes Yoda so fascinating. For most of his life, he is the greatest living Jedi of the Old Order. And yet, the Old Order falls under his watch. The Sith rise. The Jedi are destroyed. The Republic becomes the Empire. Anakin becomes Vader. The Temple burns. The younglings die. The clones turn. The galaxy falls into darkness. If power meant only strength, Yoda should have been able to prevent this, but he could not. And this forces us to see the limits of even the greatest Jedi. Yoda was wise, but not wise enough soon enough. Powerful, but not powerful enough to see through every shadow. Compassionate, but part of an institution that had become too rigid. The tragedy of Yoda is that he is both incredibly great and deeply connected to the failure of the Jedi Order. But unlike many powerful beings, Yoda learns from defeat. He goes into exile on Dagobah, and there his power changes. He is no longer the Grand Master of a galaxy-spanning order, no longer a general, no longer a council leader, no longer the face of an institution. He becomes something older, a hermit, a teacher, a keeper of what remains. On Dagobah, Yoda becomes less like a statesman and more like a mystic. And when Luke Skywalker finds him, Yoda is not interested in impressing him. He does not appear as a grand warrior. He appears strange, small, playful, almost absurd. Because Yoda understands something Luke does not. The true test is not whether Luke can recognize power when it looks powerful. The test is whether he can recognize wisdom when it is hidden. Yoda teaches Luke that size matters not, that the Force is not muscle, not machinery, not domination. He lifts Luke's X-Wing from the swamp not as a trick, but as a lesson. Luke says he does not believe it. Yoda answers that this is why he fails. That moment is one of the purest demonstrations of Jedi power in Star Wars. Not because the object is large, but because Yoda's action reveals the difference between trying and knowing, between effort and faith, between seeing the Force as a tool and living inside it. Yoda's late-life greatness is spiritual. He fails to stop the Sith directly, but he preserves the knowledge that will help Luke become something the old Jedi were not. And this may be Yoda's greatest contribution. He does not rebuild the old order through Luke. He helps create the possibility of a new understanding. A Jedi who will face Vader not with the rigid detachment of the prequel order, and not with the possessive fear of Anakin, but with compassion strong enough to reach into darkness. That is Yoda's final victory. Not defeating Sidious in the Senate, not winning the Clone Wars, but preparing Luke. And in Star Wars, the teacher's power often continues through the student. Then we come to Mace Windu. If Yoda represents ancient wisdom, Mace Windu represents disciplined force, control, precision, authority, a Jedi who stands like a blade that has never known hesitation. Mace is one of the greatest lightsaber duelists in Jedi history. He is the creator or master of Vapad, a dangerous lightsaber form that channels the user's inner darkness and reflects an opponent's darkness back at them. This makes Mace uniquely suited to fight Sith. Because most Jedi avoid the dark side by turning away from it, Mace stands near the edge without falling in. That is an extremely dangerous kind of power. It requires absolute discipline. A lesser Jedi using that path might become corrupted. Mace uses it as a weapon of control, and we see the height of his combat power when he faces Darth Sidious. This duel is one of the most debated moments in Star Wars, but within the story, what matters is clear. Mace Windu does what almost no Jedi ever does. He defeats Sidious in direct combat. The Dark Lord of the Sith, the hidden architect of the Clone Wars, the man who destroyed the Jedi Order from within the Republic itself. Mace pushes him to the floor, disarms him, stands over him, and for one moment the fate of the galaxy balances on a purple blade. That alone places Mace Windu among the most powerful Jedi in history. But Mace also reveals something important about the Jedi's weakness. He is right that Sidious is too dangerous to live. He is right that the courts are compromised. He is right that the Sith Lord controls the Senate and the system. But in that moment, Anakin sees the Jedi about to execute a defeated prisoner, and Sidious uses that moment perfectly. Mace's strength becomes part of Sidious's trap. This does not mean Mace was wrong in a simple way. Sidious was too dangerous. The Republic was already collapsing. But Star Wars often turns even correct decisions into tragedies when they arrive inside the wrong emotional moment. Mace had the power to defeat Sidious, but not the power to save Anakin from choosing him. This distinction matters. A Jedi can win the duel and still lose the galaxy. Mace Windu is one of the strongest Jedi ever to live, but his story shows that strength alone cannot heal a soul already falling. Anakin Skywalker is next. And here, the question becomes dangerous. Was Anakin the most powerful Jedi in history? In terms of raw potential, very possibly yes. Anakin was conceived by the Force, or at least born through circumstances so mysterious that the Jedi believed he might be the chosen one. His midi-chlorian count was higher than any known Jedi, even higher than Yoda's. From childhood, he displayed extraordinary instinct. Piloting, reflexes, mechanical genius, Force sensitivity. He was a miracle, and a warning at the same time. Qui-Gon Jinn saw him and believed the will of the Force had placed him in their path. The Jedi Council saw him and felt danger. Both were right. Anakin's power was not in question, his stability was. And that is the tragedy. Anakin had the potential to become the greatest Jedi who ever lived. Perhaps more powerful than Yoda. Perhaps more powerful than any Jedi before him. But potential is not destiny. The Jedi trained him. Obi-Wan loved him like a brother. Ahsoka learned from him. The Republic celebrated him as a hero. But inside Anakin, fear grew. Fear of loss, fear of helplessness. Fear that the people he loved would die while he stood by, bound by rules that could not save them. Palpatine understood that fear. He fed it, he shaped it. He whispered that the Jedi were holding Anakin back, that power could prevent death, that the dark side was not evil, only misunderstood. And Anakin, who wanted control more than peace, listened. This is why Anakin complicates the question of the most powerful Jedi. If we are measuring potential, he may be the answer. If we are measuring actual Jedi fulfillment, he is not. Because Anakin never becomes the Jedi he could have been. He becomes Darth Vader. A being of immense power, yes, but also a being of imprisonment. Burned, broken, armoured, enslaved to Sidious. Anakin's fall shows the difference between power and mastery. He had power, he lacked mastery over fear. He lacked trust. He lacked the ability to let go, and because of that, his power became the weapon that destroyed the Jedi Order. But his story does not end with Vader. That is crucial, because Anakin does return. At the end, when Luke refuses to give up on him, Anakin makes the choice he failed to make decades earlier. He turns against Sidious, he saves his son, he destroys the Sith Master, and he dies, not as Vader, but as Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one. In that final act, Anakin fulfills the prophecy. Not through conquest, not through becoming the greatest warrior, but through sacrifice. This makes Anakin one of the most powerful Force users in history. But as a Jedi, his greatness is mostly unrealized. He is the greatest possibility, the most dangerous failure, and one of the most important redemptions. If the question is, who had the greatest potential? The answer may be Anakin. If the question is, who became the greatest Jedi? We have to keep looking. Obi-Wan Kenobi deserves a place here too, not because he had the raw power of Anakin, not because he overwhelmed enemies through sheer Force strength, but because Obi-Wan represents a different kind of Jedi greatness. The power of endurance, the power of discipline, the power of remaining good after losing almost everything. Obi-Wan defeats Darth Maul as a Padawan. He trains Anakin Skywalker. He becomes one of the great generals of the Clone Wars. He defeats General Grievous. He survives Order 66. He defeats Anakin on Mustafar. And then, instead of becoming consumed by grief, he goes into exile and watches over Luke. Obi-Wan's life is almost unbearable when you slow down and look at it. He loses Qui-Gon. He loses Satine. He loses Anakin. He loses the Jedi Order. He loses the Republic. He loses the life he spent decades serving. And yet, he does not become bitter in the way many others would. He becomes sadder, quieter, more burdened, but still faithful. That is power, not the spectacular kind, not the kind that wins ranking debates easily. But in Star Wars, the ability to suffer without becoming cruel is one of the highest forms of strength. Obi-Wan may not be the most powerful Jedi in raw Force ability, but he is one of the most complete Jedi in moral endurance. He shows what the Jedi ideal looks like when the Temple is gone, when the Order is gone, when there is no council to approve your choices, when there is no army, no institution, no applause, only duty. That is why Obi-Wan matters, because the Jedi are not only tested when they are strong, They are tested when everything that supported their identity is taken away. Obi-Wan remains, and through that endurance, Luke survives. And through Luke, the Sith fall. So even if Obi-Wan is not the final answer to the question, he is part of the answer. Because without Obi-Wan, the greatest Jedi of the next generation never reaches his destiny. Then there is Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon is not usually called the most powerful Jedi, but he may be one of the most important. His power lies in his relationship with the living Force. Qui-Gon listens differently. He does not simply obey the Council. He does not reject the Jedi, but he sees where they have become too rigid, too political, too cautious, too focused on the future, and not enough on the will of the Force in the present moment. That is why he sees Anakin, not just as a boy with a high midi-chlorian count, not just as a danger, but as a person the Force has placed before him for a reason. Qui-Gon's great power is spiritual perception. He senses meaning where others see complication. And after death, his importance grows even more. Qui-Gon becomes the first modern Jedi to rediscover the path of retaining consciousness after death, the path to becoming a Force spirit. This is one of the most profound achievements in Jedi history, because it changes the relationship between life, death, and the Force. For the Sith, death is the great terror. They seek immortality through domination, essence transfer, cloning, possession, unnatural preservation. They cling to self. The Jedi path to life after death is the opposite. It comes through surrender, through compassion, through becoming part of the Force without losing the ability to guide. Qui-Gon's discovery allows Yoda to learn. Yoda teaches Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan guides Luke. And in this way, Qui-Gon's power continues after death. This is a different kind of immortality than the Sith seek. Not a refusal to die, but a willingness to pass beyond death and still serve. That may not make Qui-Gon the strongest duelist, but it makes him one of the most spiritually significant Jedi who ever lived. And if we define power as lasting influence through the Force, Qui-Gon is far greater than he first appears. Ahsoka Tano also belongs in this conversation, even though her identity becomes complicated after she leaves the Jedi Order. She is trained as a Jedi. She fights in the Clone Wars, she survives the Fall, she rejects the Order after it fails her, and yet she continues living by many of the values the Jedi were supposed to represent. Ahsoka's power is not only in combat, though she is an extraordinary fighter. She survives encounters with General Grievous, Asajj Ventress, Maul, Darth Vader, and the Inquisitors. She duels Maul during the Siege of Mandalore and defeats him through discipline, agility, and clarity. She faces Vader and survives long enough to reach the truth inside the mask. But Ahsoka's deeper power is that she walks away from the Jedi without becoming their enemy. This is rare. Many who leave the Jedi become resentful. Some fall. Some reject the Order so completely that they reject the light with it. Ahsoka does something different. She leaves the institution, but not the moral center. That makes her one of the most important Force users of the Imperial era. She becomes a bridge between worlds, between the Jedi Order and the Rebellion, between the Clone Wars and the Age of Luke, between the failures of the old Order and the possibility of something new. Is Ahsoka the most powerful Jedi in all history? Probably not in raw Force power, but she is one of the clearest examples of a Jedi spirit surviving outside Jedi structure. And that matters, because after Order 66, the galaxy does not need Jedi who only know how to function inside a temple. It needs people who can carry the light through ruin. Ahsoka does that, and her life proves that the Jedi ideal can survive even when the Jedi institution fails. Then we come to perhaps the most important name of all, Luke Skywalker. If Anakin is the greatest potential, Luke may be the greatest fulfillment. Luke begins far from the Jedi Temple, far from the Council, far from Coruscant, far from the old Order's rules and politics. He begins on Tatooine, a farm boy staring at the twin suns, feeling that his life is too small for the longing inside him. He does not grow up surrounded by Jedi doctrine. He does not spend childhood in the temple. He does not learn detachment from infancy. He grows up with family, with frustration, with dreams, with ordinary hopes. And that may be exactly why he becomes the Jedi the galaxy needs. Luke's training is incomplete by old standards. Obi-Wan gives him the first steps. Yoda trains him on Dagobah. But compared to the old Jedi, Luke receives very little formal instruction. He is not polished, he is emotional, impatient, vulnerable. He carries his father's intensity, but not his father's same wound, and he is tested by the same darkness that destroyed Anakin. Fear, anger, attachment, the desire to save those he loves. On Bespin, Luke rushes to save his friends. Yoda and Obi-Wan warn him. He goes anyway. He faces Vader before he is ready. He loses his hand, he learns the truth. Darth Vader is his father. This revelation could have destroyed him. It nearly does. But over time, Luke does something no Jedi before him was able to do. He looks at Darth Vader and sees Anakin Skywalker. This is Luke's greatest power, not moving objects, not fighting with a lightsaber, not eventually becoming a legendary Grandmaster. His greatest power is the ability to see the person inside the monster. Obi-Wan could not bring Anakin back. Yoda believed Vader had to be confronted. The Emperor believed Vader belonged to him. Vader believed Anakin was dead. Only Luke believed his father could return. That belief changes the galaxy. In Return of the Jedi, Luke walks into the throne room of the second Death Star, knowing he is facing the two most dangerous Sith in existence. Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine. He is outnumbered, manipulated, emotionally attacked, shown the suffering of his friends, tempted to strike in anger, and for a moment he nearly falls. He attacks Vader, he overwhelms him, he cuts off his father's hand and sees the echo of his own mechanical hand. And in that moment, Luke understands. He is standing at the edge of the same path, the path of fear, the path of anger, the path of becoming what he hates. And then he throws away his lightsaber. This is one of the greatest Jedi moments in history, not because Luke wins by force, but because he refuses to win as a Sith. He stands before the Emperor and says he is a Jedi like his father before him. That act defeats Sidious spiritually before Anakin defeats him physically. Luke proves that the Sith worldview is wrong. The Emperor believes everyone can be corrupted. That love can be turned into fear. That fear can be turned into anger. That anger can be turned into obedience. Luke refuses. And because Luke refuses, Anakin returns. This is why Luke may be the strongest candidate for the most powerful Jedi in history. Not because he has the highest potential, that may be Anakin. Not because he has the oldest wisdom, that may be Yoda. Not because he is the most technically perfect duelist, that could be debated. But because Luke accomplishes what no one else could. He redeems Darth Vader, he defeats the Emperor's victory at its spiritual core. He carries the Jedi forward after their destruction. And in Legends, Luke's power grows to almost unimaginable levels. He becomes Grand Master of the new Jedi Order. He faces threats far beyond the Empire. He battles dark side entities, fallen students, Yuuzhan Vong warriors, Sith spirits, and cosmic mysteries. He becomes so powerful in the Force that his presence alone can feel mythic. Legends Luke is often portrayed as the most powerful Jedi to ever live in terms of realized ability. He combines raw Skywalker potential with hard-earned wisdom. He learns from the failures of the old order. He allows attachment in a healthier way. He builds a Jedi Order that does not simply copy the past, and he becomes the living bridge between ancient Jedi tradition and a new future. But even in canon, Luke remains extraordinary. His legend spreads across the galaxy. His stand against the First Order on Crate becomes one of the most powerful acts of non-violent Jedi resistance ever seen. He projects himself across the galaxy, facing Kylo Ren without physically being there. He saves the Resistance not by destroying an army, but by becoming a symbol. The entire First Order fires on him. He stands untouched. Kylo Ren attacks him. Luke never truly strikes. And when the truth is revealed, Luke is far away on Ahch-To, giving everything he has to create hope. That act kills him, but it also reignites the spark of resistance. Again, Luke's greatest power is not domination, it is inspiration. He becomes what the Jedi were always meant to be, a light in darkness. Not because he is perfect, Luke fails too. He doubts, he fears, he makes mistakes with Ben Solo, he exiles himself. He becomes disillusioned with the Jedi legacy, but his final act is still one of restoration. He returns to the galaxy as a symbol of hope, and then passes into the Force. Luke's life suggests that the most powerful Jedi is not the one who never fails. It is the one who returns from failure without surrendering to despair. Still, the question remains. If Luke is the answer, why does the debate continue? Because Star Wars gives us many kinds of power. There is Anakin's potential, Yoda's wisdom, Mace Windu's combat mastery, Revan's strategic brilliance, Nomi Sunrider's spiritual authority, Satele Shan's leadership, Meetra Surik's strange wound-like connection, Obi-Wan's endurance, Qui-Gon's communion with the living Force, Ahsoka's survival beyond institutions, and Luke's compassion, growth, and restored Jedi legacy. Each one reflects a different answer. If the question is raw potential, Anakin Skywalker may be the most powerful Jedi ever born. If the question is ancient wisdom and mastery, Yoda stands near the top. If the question is lightsaber combat against the Sith, Mace Windu may have one of the strongest claims. If the question is strategic genius, Revan is almost impossible to ignore. If the question is spiritual influence after death, Qui-Gon Jinn changed Jedi history. If the question is moral endurance, Obi-Wan Kenobi is one of the purest examples. If the question is rebuilding the Jedi and defeating the Sith through compassion, Luke Skywalker becomes the strongest answer. And maybe that is the truth. Maybe the most powerful Jedi cannot be understood through one measurement. But if we are forced to choose one name, one Jedi, who represents the highest combination of power, compassion, legacy, and spiritual victory, the answer is Luke Skywalker. Because Luke does what the Jedi Order could not. He does what Obi-Wan could not. He does what Yoda could not. He does what Mace could not. He does what even Anakin could not do until the very end. Luke faces the darkness of Darth Vader and refuses to believe that darkness is the whole truth. He faces the Emperor and refuses the logic of the Sith. He chooses faith without naivety, love without possession, defiance without hatred, and hope when history says hope should be dead. That is Jedi power at its highest, not simply the power to move the galaxy, but the power to save the soul at the center of it. And yet, even after naming Luke, the other Jedi do not become lesser. They become part of the path that makes Luke possible. Qui-Gon finds Anakin. Obi-Wan trains Anakin and later guides Luke. Yoda teaches Luke to understand the Force beyond physical limits. Anakin's fall creates the wound Luke must heal. Mace's failure shows the limit of righteous violence. Ahsoka's survival shows that the light can exist beyond the Order. Revan's story warns that power without balance becomes conquest. Nomi's story shows that the Force can end darkness without hatred. Meetra's story shows that even wounds can become channels of connection. Satele's story shows that legacy can be carried without being repeated. Kanan's story shows that the Jedi can return through sacrifice. Ezra's story shows that the Force can work through unexpected people. Rey's story shows that bloodline does not have to be destiny. The greatest Jedi are not isolated monuments, they are constellations. Each one shines differently, each one reveals a different face of the Force. And together they tell the story of what the Jedi are. Not perfect, never perfect, often flawed, sometimes blind, sometimes arrogant, sometimes too rigid for the living galaxy around them. But at their best, the Jedi represent the belief that power does not have to become domination. That strength can protect instead of possess. That grief can become service. That fear can be faced without surrendering to it. That even in a galaxy of war, slavery, empire, betrayal, and darkness, there can still be people who choose the light. This is why the Jedi endure in Star Wars. Not because they always win, they do not. The Jedi lose often, they lose worlds, they lose wars, they lose students, they lose temples, they lose themselves. But again and again, from the ancient wars to the age of the Empire, the light returns through someone. A grieving widow who becomes a great master. A fallen warrior who finds redemption. An exile who reconnects to the Force through others. A grand master who turns defeat into wisdom. A young man from Tatooine who saves his father. That is the real power of the Jedi. Continuity through compassion. Survival through hope. Victory not always over death, but over meaninglessness. The Sith often burn brighter in the moment. They seize thrones, command armies, destroy enemies, build empires, but their power consumes itself. Master betrays apprentice, apprentice betrays master, fear becomes paranoia, control becomes imprisonment, immortality becomes decay. The Jedi, when they are truly aligned with the light, do something different. They pass the flame, they teach, they sacrifice, they become part of something beyond themselves. And that is why Luke Skywalker stands so high. Because Luke receives the broken inheritance of the Jedi, and does not simply repeat it, he transforms it. He is the son of the fallen chosen one, the student of the last masters, the hope of the rebellion, the enemy of the Emperor, the one person who looks at Vader and sees not only what he is, but what he could still choose to be. That is a power no Sith understands. Because the Sith look at weakness and see opportunity. Luke looks at weakness and sees someone worth saving. The Sith look at fear and see a chain. Luke looks at fear and chooses trust. The Sith look at family and see leverage. Luke looks at family and finds the path to redemption. That is why, in the end, the Emperor loses. Not because Luke is stronger in the way the Emperor understands strength, But because Luke is strong in a way the Emperor cannot understand at all. The Emperor can understand ambition, anger, fear, hunger. He can manipulate those things easily, but he cannot understand selfless love. He cannot understand mercy that refuses to become weakness. He cannot understand a son willing to die rather than become his father's replacement. And because he cannot understand it, he cannot defeat it. This is the great irony of the Sith. They seek ultimate power, but blind themselves to the power that finally destroys them. Luke becomes the vessel of that power, and Anakin, seeing it, remembers who he is. So the most powerful Jedi in history may not be the one who could crush the most enemies. It may be the one who could stand before the worst enemy in the galaxy and still choose compassion. That does not make Luke soft. It makes him almost impossibly strong. Because compassion in Star Wars is not sentimental, it is dangerous. It requires standing in front of darkness without becoming it. It requires hope when hope looks foolish. It requires seeing the good in someone who may still kill you. It requires surrendering control without surrendering courage. Luke does all of this. And through it, he restores Anakin. He breaks the Sith. He gives the galaxy a future. But perhaps there is one more answer, beneath even Luke. The Force itself. Because every great Jedi, no matter how powerful, is not powerful alone. Yoda is powerful because he serves the Force. Luke is powerful because he trusts it. Qui-Gon is powerful because he listens to it. Nomi is powerful because she acts through it. Obi-Wan is powerful because he remains faithful to it. Ahsoka is powerful because she carries its light after the Order fails. The Jedi are not gods. They are not meant to be. When they try to become too certain, they fall into blindness. When they try to control too much, they become vulnerable to fear. When they forget humility, the dark side grows in the spaces they refuse to see. The greatest Jedi are those who remember that they are not the source of the light. They are its servants. That may be the deepest answer to the whole question. The most powerful Jedi is not simply the one who has the most Force within them. It is the one who most fully allows the Force to move through them without being possessed by ego, fear, or domination. Anakin had more raw power than almost anyone. But for most of his life, fear distorted it. Yoda had ancient wisdom. But the Order's blindness limited what he could see. Mace had incredible discipline, but could not save Anakin's soul in the decisive moment. Revan had brilliance, but fell to the darkness he tried to master. Luke had power, but more importantly, he had the willingness to believe in redemption when every teacher told him it was impossible. That is why Luke rises above the others. Because he does not merely use the Force. He trusts its deepest truth, that no one is beyond choice. That darkness is real, but not absolute. That a fallen soul can return. That love, when freed from possession, can become salvation. And that is why his victory echoes beyond the throne room. The Death Star is destroyed. The Emperor falls. Vader dies. The Empire begins to fracture. But the true victory is quieter. A son saves his father. A father saves his son. The Chosen One returns. The Sith are broken by the one thing they spent generations dismissing as weakness, compassion. So when we ask who the most powerful Jedi in all of history was, the answer depends on what kind of power we mean. Anakin was the most powerful in potential. Yoda was the greatest master of the Old Order. Mace Windu was one of the deadliest Jedi duelists. Revan was one of the greatest warrior strategists. Nomi Sunrider was one of the most spiritually decisive. Qui-Gon Jinn was one of the most important mystics. Obi-Wan Kenobi was one of the greatest survivors. Ahsoka Tano was one of the clearest lights beyond the Order. But Luke Skywalker was the Jedi who brought all of those lessons together. Power, failure, training, love, fear, mercy, sacrifice, and hope. He was not the first Jedi, not the oldest, not the most formally trained, not the most politically important. But he became the answer to the question the Jedi had been struggling with for generations. How do you defeat darkness without becoming it? Luke's answer was simple. Not easy, but simple. You refuse to hate. You refuse to give up on the good that still exists. You throw away the weapon when the weapon becomes the path to your fall. And you trust that the light can reach places even the Jedi had stopped believing it could reach. That is why Luke Skywalker stands at the center of this story. Because the most powerful Jedi is not the one who never touches darkness. It is the one who stands before darkness, sees it clearly, and still chooses the light. And as the galaxy turns, as empires rise and fall, as temples burn and new students are born, that choice remains the heart of the Jedi. Not victory, not reputation, not bloodline, not prophecy alone, choice, again and again, in fear, in grief, in failure, in exile, in the final moment when hatred seems easier. The Jedi are powerful because they choose, and the greatest Jedi are those whose choices give others the strength to choose as well. In the end, perhaps that is what the Force was always moving toward. Not the strongest warrior, not the perfect monk, not the flawless order, but a moment of impossible compassion in the heart of a darkness. A son before his father, a Jedi before the Emperor, a lightsaber thrown away. A choice that saves the galaxy. That is the power of Luke Skywalker, and that is the power of the Jedi at their highest. Not to rule the Force, but to surrender to it so completely that even in the shadow of death, the light can still find a way through. And maybe that is why the Jedi endure. Because somewhere, in every age, there is someone willing to listen, someone willing to stand between the innocent and the dark, someone willing to let go, someone willing to forgive, someone willing to fight without hatred, someone willing to believe that the future does not have to be a prisoner of the past. That is the Jedi way. And in all the long history of that way, Luke Skywalker may be its brightest expression. The farm boy, the student, the son, the brother, the last hope, the new beginning. The Jedi who looked at the most feared man in the galaxy and said, without words, that he was still worth saving. That is not just power. That is the kind of power the Sith never understood. And because they never understood it, they never truly defeated it. The dark side can destroy temples. It can corrupt governments. It can turn heroes into monsters. It can build empires. It can silence worlds. But it cannot fully extinguish a light that is freely chosen. That is why the Jedi return. That is why the stories continue. And that is why, when the question is asked across all of history, the answer is not only about strength. It is about meaning. The most powerful Jedi is the one whose power becomes hope for everyone else. And in the long-wounded, beautiful history of Star Wars, that Jedi is Luke Skywalker.